Hello, my lovely anatomists and physiologists. Michele Glass here. We want to talk just a little bit about the different types of muscle fibers. So muscle fibers are going to be characterized in the body based on two characteristics. So we will see muscle fibers characterized based on the speed of contraction. And then we'll also see them characterized based on how they produce ATP, how they produce ATP. And remember, we had the choices of anaerobic glycolysis. This is not super efficient. Not efficient. It produces that lactic acid, which can lead to muscle fatigue. Or we had the choice of the aerobic respiration. And we said in this case, they could either be using the glucose that was stored in the form of glycogen or glucose from the bloodstream, or they could be using fatty acids broken down in order to make ATP, or they could use the pyruvic acid here. And remember, this process is occurring at the mitochondria, which we talked about as being the powerhouses of the cell, right? And the other feature is aerobic respiration. Aerobic means with oxygen, anaerobic means without oxygen. So that's another difference. There are 3 different types of muscle fibers, and they have different attributes, and they're adapted to different types of muscle contractions. And what we see is that human muscle contains all 3 types. And what we'll see is there will be a genetic component to the makeup of your muscle, and the makeup of your muscle can change depending on how you're using your body and working your body. So you can change the component of your muscle to some extent through training, through activity. Okay, so what I have done here is another one of my famous tables. So what we're seeing is we have I have 6 columns and 4 rows, 6 columns and 4 rows. And your column headings, the first column is types of muscle fibers. The next column is how is ATP produced. The next one is the rate or speed of contraction. And then rate or speed of fatigue. Important cellular characteristics and types of movement. And then to the row headings, underneath types of muscle fibers, I have slow oxidative, which is abbreviated SO. I have fast oxidative, which is abbreviated FO. And then fast glycolytic, which is abbreviated FC. And these terms, oxidative and glycolytic, are basically referring to the chemical reactions that are taking place in terms of ATP production. So depending on your study of cellular respiration, whether you studied it in more detail in biology class, you may understand that perfectly well, or it may not be a name that really connects for you. Let's start by looking at ATP production for each. So in the case of our slow oxidative, we're going to do aerobic respiration. We're going to do aerobic respiration. In the case of our fast oxidative, we're going to do aerobic respiration, and then it may switch to just glycolysis. So oxidative is talking about the reactions that are taking place in the mitochondria during aerobic respiration. So that's why slow oxidative is termed that way, and that's why fast oxidative is termed that way. So some of you may already be kind of guessing when we talk about fast glycolytic, it's named fast glycolytic because it's limited to aerobic glycolysis. Anaerobic, not sure if I said the right word. Fast glycolytic is limited to anaerobic glycolysis. And a lot of times people will just say glycolysis because those of us who've studied know that it's an anaerobic process. And so very often we don't include that as like an adjective. Let's next look at the rate or speed of contraction. So in case of the slow oxidative, it's named slow because it's slow to build tension. So the slow oxidative name tells us it's slow to build tension, and the oxidative part tells us it's doing aerobic respiration. And so the other two are both termed fast, and that's because they are fast to build tension. But we are seeing that they produce ATP in different ways, and so this will give us insights into their differences in fatigue and also cellular characteristics. So let's move on to rate of fatigue. In the case of the slow oxidative, what we see is that it's slow to fatigue. It's going to be slow to fatigue, so it can sustain contraction over a long time. So it's slow to build the tension, but it's long to hold it. Slow to build the tension, but it's long to hold it. In the case of the fast oxidative, I'm going to call it medium to fatigue. So what we're going to see is that it's going to be faster to fatigue than the SO, but slower than the FC. So I'm just going to leave it here, fast, medium to fatigue. And then the last one, the fast glycolytic, is going to be the quickest one to fatigue. So it fatigues the fastest. And the reason for this, let's go ahead and include that. The reason is because it's limited to glycolysis. So it has, that automatically means limited ATP production. And we saw in our earlier videos that one of the contributors to fatigue of a muscle is just simply running out of ATP. Okay, so let's take a look at how the cells are different in their anatomy and their physiology. Really, the cellular characteristics are more about the anatomy, right? And so when we look at a slow oxidative muscle cell, we see that they have lots of mitochondria. This should make sense. They're doing aerobic respiration, and this occurs at the mitochondria. And this is also how they can sustain those contractions for a longer time because they're producing so much ATP. They do have a small diameter, so that means they're not really full of those myofibrils. So this is not like a super powerful muscle. This is not a cell that has a lot of power. They do have a high blood supply. And this makes sense also because aerobic respiration requires oxygen, and that oxygen is coming from the blood supply. And they also have this molecule called myoglobin, which is a way to store oxygen. So myoglobin is a molecule that lets the cell store oxygen. So because the slow oxidative cell is doing aerobic respiration and that's all it can do, it has to either have a lot of oxygen coming directly from the blood supply, or it has to have a lot that's stored and on hand. When we look at the fast oxidative, Let's go ahead and make a note on the side over here that sometimes the fast oxidative muscle fiber is just talked about as an intermediate muscle fiber. This one then makes sense. It's kind of in between on fatigue and characteristics between the slow oxidative and the fast glycolytic. So here what we're going to see is it does have lots of mitochondria, because remember, we're still doing aerobic respiration here, but it's lacking in the myoglobin. So this is why it might sometimes have to switch to glycolysis if it's contracting so rapidly that, you know, it's used up all the available oxygen and there's not really time to get that oxygen recruited from the blood supply. It's not got any stores of myoglobin, so this cell is going to switch then at that point to glycolysis. We're going to see that this one can be intermediate in terms of its diameter. So depending on training, you might have more or fewer myofibrils here. And so this can be a very powerful muscle cell. When we look at the fast glycolytic muscle fiber, this one has few mitochondria. Because they're just doing glycolysis. So they don't really need the mitochondria here. And no myoglobin. It's going to have a large diameter, which allows it to really do these rapid and forceful types of muscle contractions. So this is going to be a super powerful muscle fiber, but it's going to fatigue really quickly. So let's look at what types of movements we might see in each. So a slow oxidative muscle is going to be important in our posture. So again, it has to be these contractions that are sustained for a long period of time, but you know, it doesn't have to be like a super fast coming on board. Any kind of isometric contractions, and those are like those tense and hold types of movements. And these muscle fibers are important in stabilizing our joints. When we look at fast oxidative, we see that these are really good for like walking. So these are good for kinds of movements where we do need to have a good amount of power, but it needs to be sustained, right? So this is something that I'm just going to describe it here as creating, I'm going to call it sustainable power movements. So it's going to take more effort, more energy to actually walk, propel the body than maybe just like holding the body upright. Does that make sense? Hopefully that resonates. When we talk about the fast glycolytic, these are going to be like rapid burst, like a burst of movement is what I'm going to call it here. Burst of movement. Not sustained. Okay, so if I need to turn my head really quick to look at something, I start to feel fatigue really quick. I need to turn my whole body if I have to keep looking in that direction. You could even go back and say, if I just look with my eyeballs, so just move my eyeballs to my right, that starts to become very uncomfortable very fast. So I might move my whole head to the right, and that's going to start becoming very uncomfortable. And so I might move my whole torso or then my whole body in that direction so I can sit, you know, with ease. So the fast glycolytic are those like a really rapid kind of sprinting, sprinting kind of movements, right? That have to be sustained, that don't have to be sustained. Whereas the fast oxidative would be more like that marathon running or the walking where you're doing a movement that does require some power, but it also needs to be like sustainable power. And remember then our muscle cells, our whole muscles are composed of all three types of cells. And as we train our body, we can see especially those intermediate fast oxidative muscle fibers taking on kind of like these in-between properties. So that is able to allow us to do these isometric contractions, sustaining those, but also doing more of these rapid fire kind of movements. All right. Stay tuned. We have just 1 or 2 more videos left. Can you believe it? All right. As always, take care of yourselves and each other.